A bug smaller than a grain of rice cost farmers in the Midwest hundreds of millions of dollars. It didn't destroy crops overnight. It didn't look like a disaster until the fields started falling, one row at a time. And the only way to stop it was something most farmers refused to do. In the cornfields of central Iowa, in the late summer of 2006, you could stand at the edge of a field and feel something was wrong before you even saw it. The rows were still there, but they weren't standing the way they should. Corn is supposed to stand tall, straight, rigid, like soldiers in formation. But these fields looked different. The stalks leaned at strange angles. Some bent halfway down. Some lay completely flat against the ground. And there was no wind, no storm, no visible cause. Just acres of corn collapsing. If you walked into that field and grabbed one of those fallen plants, you'd feel it immediately. It came out of the ground too easily. No resistance, no anchor, just a loose grip on the soil that gave way in your hands. And when you looked at the roots, that's when you understood. They weren't strong. They weren't deep. They weren't even complete. They had been eaten. Not by something large, not by anything you could see moving above the soil, but by something small. Something patient, something already finished with its work before anyone realized it had started. If you broke apart the dirt near the base, you might find them. Tiny, pale, almost invisible against the soil. Larvae, each one no bigger than a grain of rice. They don't attack the leaves. They don't chew the stalk. They don't make noise. They don't announce themselves. They stay underground, and they eat the roots, slowly, relentlessly, until the plant has nothing left to stand on. By the time the damage shows above ground, it's already over. The plant can't take in water. It can't pull nutrients. It can't hold itself upright. And when harvest comes, the combine can't even reach it. What looks like a strong field from a distance turns into a loss you can't recover. The insect responsible has a name, Diabrotica virgifera, the western corn rootworm. And for decades, it has been one of the most expensive pests in American agriculture. But here's the part most farmers already knew. The rootworm has a weakness. Just one. It depends on corn. Every year, adult beetles lay their eggs in the soil of a cornfield. Those eggs stay there through winter, and when spring comes, they hatch. Larvae emerge and immediately search for corn roots. If they find them, they survive. If they don't, they die. For generations, farmers used that weakness against it. They rotated crops. Corn one year, something else the next. And when the larvae hatched, there was nothing there. No food, no roots, no survival. The cycle broke itself, quietly, naturally, without chemicals, without technology. And for a long time, that was enough. Then something changed. Not in the insect, not in the soil, but in the numbers. Corn prices began to rise, higher than they had ever been, year after year, bushel after bushel, money growing straight out of the ground. And slowly, the question changed. Not what keeps the system stable, but how much can I make this year? Rotation meant planting something that wasn't corn. Rotation meant earning less right now. And when the difference reached hundreds of thousands of dollars, most farmers made the same decision. They stopped rotating. Corn after corn after corn. At first, nothing happened. The yields were strong. The profits were higher than ever. And the old system looked unnecessary. Because for a few years, it worked. Until it didn't. For most farmers, the decision didn't feel risky. It felt obvious. Corn was paying more than anything else. And not just a little more, a lot more. In the mid-2000s, corn prices climbed to levels most farmers had never seen before. $5, $6, at times even higher. And every acre planted to corn looked like guaranteed money. If you owned 1,000 acres and you planted all of it in corn, you could gross over $1 million in a single season. The math was simple, clear, hard to ignore. But if you rotated, if you planted soybeans or oats or hay, you gave some of that money up. Not eventually, immediately. That year. And for many farmers, that difference wasn't small. It was hundreds of thousands of dollars. Money you could see. Money you could calculate. Money you could lose just by choosing not to plant corn. So the rotation started to disappear. Slowly at first, then all at once. Fields that had been rotated for decades were planted to corn 2 years in a row, then 3, then 5, then 10. Corn on corn became the new normal. Not because farmers didn't understand rotation, but because the market made ignoring it feel like the smarter decision. And there was something else. Something that made the risk seem even smaller. Technology. By the early 2000s, seed companies had introduced something new. Genetically modified corn designed to kill rootworm larvae. They called it BT corn, a built-in defense, a solution inside the seed itself. The idea was simple. The plant produced a protein toxic to the larvae. When the larvae fed on the roots, they died. Problem solved. And for a while, it worked. It worked well. Fields planted continuously to corn stayed clean. The rootworm population dropped. The damage disappeared. And the confidence grew. Farmers began to believe they had finally beaten the pest. Not with rotation, but with technology. Which meant they didn't have to rotate anymore. They could plant corn year after year without consequences. At least, that's what it looked like. Because every year that passed without problems made the system feel safer, more reliable, more permanent. And every year of high corn prices made it harder to justify going back. Why give up profit to prevent something that wasn't happening? Why sacrifice income for a risk you couldn't see? So they stayed with corn. And stayed. And stayed. Until most of the county was doing the same thing. Corn on nearly every acre, every year. And the few who didn't stood out. They looked different. They looked wrong. They looked behind. Because when everyone around you is making money, doing something different doesn't look like wisdom. It looks like a mistake. And in that moment, there was one farmer in the county who refused to follow. Not because he didn't understand the math, but because he didn't trust it. And what he understood was something the market couldn't measure. Because the system only works until it doesn't. His name was Harold Becker. He farmed 640 acres, just outside a small town most people would never notice on a map. The land had been in his family for 3 generations. Same soil, same fields, same rotation. Corn, soybeans, oats, hay, then back to corn again. A 4-year cycle that hadn't changed since his grandfather started it. Not because Harold was sentimental, not because he didn't understand modern farming, but because every time he looked at the numbers over more than 1 year, the system made sense. Still, by 2008, almost nobody else was doing it. At the co-op, his name came up the same way every spring. Harold's planting oats again. Oats in a $6 corn market. Must be nice to leave money on the table. Some laughed. Some shook their heads. Some genuinely didn't understand. Because on paper, it didn't make sense. If corn paid the most, why not plant corn everywhere? Why waste acres on crops that earned less? Why stick to a system that limited your income? Harold never argued with that math. He couldn't. In any single year, they were right. If he planted all 640 acres in corn, he would make more money. A lot more. But Harold wasn't looking at 1 year. He was looking at 10, 20, 30. And over that timeline, the math changed. Because his corn was different. Not genetically, not visually, but in what it grew on. Fields that had spent the previous year in hay held moisture better. Fields that followed oats had fewer weeds. Fields that hadn't seen corn in 3 years had almost no rootworm pressure at all. His yields were consistent. Not always the highest, but never the lowest. And more importantly, they didn't collapse. While others adjusted their inputs every season, more chemicals, more seed traits, more cost, Harold adjusted almost nothing because his system handled the problems before they started. He didn't spray for rootworm. He didn't need to. There was nothing there to kill, no population to manage, no cycle to break. The pest never built up in the first place because the crop it depended on wasn't there long enough. And that was the part most people didn't see. They saw fewer acres of corn. They saw lower total revenue. They saw a farmer doing less of what paid the most. What they didn't see was what he wasn't losing. No emergency sprays, no failing traits, no sudden drops in yield. Just a system that kept working, year after year. At the elevator, they still joked about him, not as loudly as before, but enough. Enough to remind him he was different. Harold didn't mind. He had seen this before. Different crops, different prices, same pattern. Something works until it doesn't. And when it stops working, Everyone looks for something new, something stronger, something faster, something that fixes the problem again. But Harold wasn't looking for a fix. He was avoiding the problem entirely. And that only works if you're willing to look wrong for a long time. By 2010, he was one of the last farmers in the county still rotating like this. Almost everyone else had moved on, moved forward, moved into something that looked better. And for a while, it was. The yields were high, the profits were strong, the system held, until the year it didn't. It started quietly. Not with a headline, not with a warning, just small signs that most people ignored. A field here with slightly weaker roots, another there leaning just a little more than it should. Nothing dramatic, nothing urgent, nothing that looked like a crisis at first. Then the reports started coming in. Farmers pulling plants and finding roots that didn't look right, shorter, thinner, damaged, even in fields planted with Bt corn. That wasn't supposed to happen. The technology was designed to stop this. That was the whole point. But the damage was real, and it was spreading. By mid-season, it was no longer isolated. It was everywhere. Fields that had been planted corn after corn for 5, 8, 10 years straight were all showing the same pattern. Root damage, stalks leaning, plants falling. The rootworm hadn't disappeared. It had adapted. Year after year, the same control method had been used, the same trait, the same target, the same system. And over time, the insects that survived became the population. Stronger, harder to kill, unaffected by what used to work. Resistance. That was the word the agronomist used, but in the field, it looked like failure. Farmers responded the only way they knew how. They added more insecticide, more cost, more attempts to regain control. But it didn't fix the problem. Because the problem wasn't lack of input, it was the system itself. By harvest, the losses were impossible to ignore. Fields that should have yielded 200 bushels per acre were producing 150, sometimes less. 40, 50 bushels gone. Across hundreds of acres, across entire operations. At $4 a bushel, that wasn't just a bad year. That was hundreds of thousands of dollars gone. And the worst part was that nobody could stop it. Not with chemicals, not with traits, not with anything they had relied on before. Because everything they relied on was part of the same system that had created the problem. Fields that had been planted to corn year after year had built the perfect environment, not for the crop, but for the pest. And now the system was collapsing under its own design. Across the county, farmers started comparing notes, talking at the co-op, at the elevator, on the edge of fields that no longer made sense. Same seed, same inputs, same practices, different results, worse results. Something had changed, and nobody could fix it fast enough. Except, there was one place where the damage didn't show up. Not reduced. Not delayed. Absent. Harold Becker's fields were still standing, straight, healthy, untouched. Same county, same weather, same pest, different outcome. Because the pest had adapted to the system everyone else was using, but not to his. And for the first time, the question wasn't, why is he doing it that way? But, what does he know that we don't? The first one came on a Saturday morning. A pickup truck pulling slowly into Harold Becker's driveway. Then another, and another. By noon, there were 6 trucks parked outside his barn. Men who hadn't spoken to him in months, now standing in his yard, waiting. Not to argue, not to laugh, but to ask. Harold stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He already knew why they were there. He had been expecting it. How are your fields clean? That was the first question. Direct. No small talk. No pride left to protect. Harold didn't answer right away. Instead, he asked them something back. What did you plant last year? Corn, one of them said. And the year before? Corn. And before that? Corn. Harold nodded. Then he pointed out toward his fields. You don't have a pest problem, he said. You have a pattern problem. They stood there, quiet, because they already knew he was right. They just hadn't said it out loud yet. Harold walked them through it, not like a lecture, not like he was proving a point, just explaining, the same way his father had explained it to him. The pest survives only if the crop is there, every year, without interruption. Break the cycle, and the pest disappears, not weakens, not reduces, disappears. No chemicals, no upgrades, no rescue plan, just time used differently. One of the farmers shook his head. I can't afford to give up corn, he said. Harold looked at him. You already did, he said quietly. Because that was the truth. They hadn't protected their profit. They had borrowed it from the future. And now the future had arrived. Over the next year, things began to change. Slowly, reluctantly, but undeniably. Fields that had been corn for a decade were planted to soybeans. Some tried oats. A few went further, adding hay back into the system. Not because it paid more, but because they had seen what happened without it. The numbers shifted. Not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily. Yields stabilized. Costs dropped. The pest pressure faded, and something else returned. Something most of them hadn't realized they'd lost. Control. Not control over the market, not control over the weather. Control over the weather but control over the system they were actually part of. Harold didn't change anything. He didn't need to. His system had already accounted for the problem before it showed up. That was the difference. Not intelligence, not luck, not timing. Just a different way of thinking about time. Most farmers had been optimizing for this year. Harold had been optimizing for all of them. And when the system broke, his didn't. Because the rootworm can adapt to chemicals. It can adapt to genetics. It can adapt to anything you repeat often enough. But it cannot adapt to the absence of what it needs. That's the part they missed. The simplest solution was never something you added. It was something you removed. And by the time they understood that, the damage had already been done. They called him old-fashioned. They said he was leaving money on the table. They said he didn't understand modern farming. But in the end, he was the only one who understood what the system was actually doing. Because in farming, like in everything else, you can ignore the rules for a while. You can even profit from it for a time. But eventually, the system corrects itself. And when it does, it doesn't negotiate. The farmers who rotated didn't win more. They just didn't lose. And sometimes, that's the only advantage that matters.